The screaming came at 3 in the morning, cutting through the humid darkness like a rusty blade. I pressed my face deeper into the coral sand, feeling the sharp fragments bite into my cheek as the ground shook beneath me. Somewhere in the black void ahead, 1,000 Japanese voices rose in a death chant that made my blood freeze. Banzai! Banzai! They were coming again, and this time they meant to drive every last Marine into the sea. I am Staff Sergeant Tommy Mitchell, and I'm about to tell you about the 25 days that changed the course of World War II. The place was Saipan, a tiny speck of coral and volcanic rock in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The time was June 1944, and what happened there would crack open Japan's inner defenses like a sledgehammer through glass. But first, we had to survive the night. The flamethrower team to my left suddenly erupted in orange fire, painting the landscape in hellish shadows. I could see them now, hundreds of Japanese soldiers charging straight into our lines with bayonets fixed, officers waving samurai swords above their heads. Some carried nothing but bamboo spears. They knew they were going to die, and they didn't care. That's what made them so terrifying. Hold the line. I screamed over the chaos, though I could barely hear my own voice above the thunder of artillery and the rattle of machine guns. My squad was spread out in foxholes along a ridge we'd paid for in blood 3 days earlier. Every man was firing as fast as he could work his bolt. The bar gunner, a kid from Iowa named Danny Kowalski, was laying down such a curtain of lead that his barrel glowed red in the darkness. But let me back up and tell you how we got here, because the story of Saipan didn't start with that banzai charge. It started 6 months earlier, in the planning rooms of Pearl Harbor, where generals and admirals were drawing circles around maps and arguing about the future of the war. By early 1944, we'd been island hopping across the Pacific for 2 years, leaving a trail of blood and burning Japanese bases behind us. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Kwajalein, each name etched in Marine Corps legend, each one costing us more good men than I care to remember. But Saipan was different. Saipan was the key to everything. You see, this little island, barely 12 miles long and 5 miles wide, sat right in the heart of Japan's inner defensive ring. The Marianas, they called it Saipan, Guam, and Tinian. Take these islands, and our new B-29 superfortresses could reach the Japanese home islands. More than that, we'd cut the supply lines that kept Japan's war machine running. Oil from Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Southeast Asia, all of it flowed through the Marianas on its way to Japan. The Japanese knew it too. They'd been fortifying Saipan for 20 years, ever since they'd taken it from Germany after World War I. 30,000 troops were dug into that coral rock like ticks on a hound dog. Concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, artillery pieces hidden in caves that our naval bombardment couldn't touch. And commanding it all was Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, a veteran who'd cut his teeth fighting in Manchuria. But we had advantages too. Operation Fortresser, they called our invasion plan. 4 Marine divisions and 1 Army division, over 160,000 men in all. The largest Pacific amphibious assault up to that point. Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the overall operation, with General Howland Mads Smith leading the ground forces. These were serious men who'd learned hard lessons in previous campaigns. I remember the morning of June 11, 1944, standing on the deck of the USS Cambria as our transport moved into position off Saipan's western beaches. The pre-invasion bombardment had been going on for 2 days already. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers pounding the island with shells the size of telephone poles. Carrier planes swooping in to drop bombs and strafe anything that moved. "Looks like the Navy's turned that rock into hamburger," said Corporal Williams, my assistant squad leader. He was a good Marine from Alabama, steady under fire, with a drawl so thick you could cut it with a bayonet. I wasn't so sure. We'd heard the same promises before Tarawa, and that beach had turned into a slaughter yard. Maybe, I said, adjusting my pack straps and checking my Thompson submachine gun for the 100th time. But those Japs are dug in deep. Navy shells don't dig them out, we do. The morning of June 15th came gray and humid. At 0545 hours, the landing craft started their run toward the beaches. I was in the lead boat of my platoon, watching the island grow larger through the morning haze. From a distance, Saipan looked almost peaceful, green hills rising from white sand beaches, palm trees swaying in the trade winds. It was hard to believe that 30,000 enemy soldiers were waiting for us in those hills. The first sign of trouble came when we were still 800 yards from shore. A Japanese artillery shell exploded in the water 50 yards to our right, throwing up a column of spray that soaked everyone in the boat. Then another and another. The enemy had zeroed in on our approach routes during the bombardment, just waiting for us to show up. "Keep your heads down," I yelled, though there wasn't anywhere to go in that packed landing craft. 30 Marines crammed together like sardines, each man lost in his own thoughts about what waited ahead. Some prayed silently, lips moving without sound. Others checked their gear one more time or stared at pictures of sweethearts back home. A few threw up from seasickness or nerves. Private Rodriguez, barely 18 and fresh from boot camp, looked green around the gills. "Sergeant," he said, voice shaking, "what's it gonna be like?" I'd been through this before, but every landing was different, and every landing was hell in its own way. "You follow my lead, keep your rifle clean, and remember your training," I told him. "Marines have been doing this for 200 years, son. We know how." The truth was, none of us knew what to expect. Intelligence reports said the beaches were lightly defended, that the Japanese would pull back to the hills and make their stand there. As our Higgins boat ground up onto the coral sand of Red Beach, I started to think maybe the reports were right. No machine gun fire, no mortars, just scattered rifle shots from the tree line. We went over the sides fast, Marines splashing into knee-deep water and running for the shore. My squad spread out automatically, following tactics drilled into us during months of training. Find cover, establish fields of fire, advance by bounds. The manual made it sound simple, but the Japanese were waiting. They'd learned from their defeats at Tarawa and other islands. No more throwing men away in suicidal charges against our beachheads. This time they'd let us land, let us get crowded together on the narrow beaches, and then they'd hit us with everything they had. The first 75mm shell landed right in the middle of a Marine platoon that had been advancing toward the airfield. Bodies flew through the air like rag dolls. Then the mortars started falling, walking across the beach in neat rows, each explosion throwing up geysers of sand and coral fragments. Japanese machine guns opened up from concealed positions, their distinctive rapid-fire chatter adding to the chaos. "Move inland. Get off the beach," I screamed, though the order was unnecessary. Every Marine knew that beaches were death traps. The only safety lay in getting off the sand and into the jungle where we could fight back. But the jungle wasn't safety, it was just a different kind of hell. The first 3 days on Saipan were a nightmare of heat, coral dust, and sudden death. The Japanese had turned every cave, every boulder, every stand of trees into a fortress. You'd think you'd cleared an area, only to have machine gun fire erupt from a spider hole you'd walked past 3 times. Snipers tied themselves into palm trees and picked off Marines from hundreds of yards away. The terrain was our enemy too. Saipan's volcanic origins had left it covered with coral formations that cut through boots and uniforms like razor blades. The heat was crushing over 100 degrees in the shade, with humidity that soaked your clothes in sweat before you'd taken 10 steps. Water was precious, ammunition was heavy, and every yard cost blood. My squad had started with 12 men. By the end of the second day, we were down to 8. Rodriguez caught a sniper bullet through the chest while crossing a clearing near the village of Chirin. He died calling for his mother in Spanish, The same words my grandfather had whispered in his final moments back in Texas. Williams took shrapnel in the leg from a mortar round but refused evacuation. "I ain't leaving you boys," he said through gritted teeth, and kept fighting with a blood-soaked bandage wrapped around his thigh. The Japanese resistance was unlike anything we'd encountered before. These weren't the desperate garrison troops we'd faced on some of the other islands. The 43rd Infantry Division defending Saipan were veteran soldiers, well-equipped and well-led. They'd had months to prepare their positions, and they used every advantage the terrain offered. On June 18th, our third day on the island, my platoon got orders to take Hill 500, a coral ridge that dominated the approaches to a Slido airfield. Intelligence said it was lightly held. Intelligence was wrong. The hill was honeycombed with caves and tunnels, connected by a network of trenches that let the Japanese move unseen from position to position. Every time we thought we'd cleared a section, enemy soldiers would pop up behind us like deadly jack in the boxes. Our flamethrower teams worked overtime, sending streams of liquid fire into cave mouths and bunker apertures. The smell of burned coral and worse things hung in the air like a toxic fog. Sergeant Kowalski, my bar gunner, was pointing toward a camouflaged bunker about 50 yards up the slope. "I see movement in there." I squinted through the heat haze and caught a glimpse of a steel helmet disappearing into the shadows. "Williams, take 3 men around the left flank. Danny, keep that position suppressed. Everyone else, we're going straight up the middle." The assault was textbook Marine Corps tactics, fire and maneuver, small unit leadership, aggressive action. But textbooks don't account for the human cost. Private Johnson stepped on a mine while moving to flank the bunker. The explosion took his left leg below the knee and sent coral fragments flying like shrapnel. His screams brought Japanese mortar fire down on our position, forcing us to choose between helping our wounded and maintaining the attack. We chose the attack. We always chose the attack. That's what Marines do. It took us 6 hours to clear Hill 500. When we finally planted the American flag on its summit, we'd lost 4 more men from my squad. The hilltop was littered with Japanese bodies, soldiers who'd fought to the death rather than surrender. Most had explosive charges strapped to their chests, set to detonate if they were captured alive. The few who tried to surrender were often wired with grenades, ready to take Marines with them in a final act of defiance. But taking Hill 500 was just the beginning. Beyond it lay the real fortress Mount Tapochau, the highest point on Saipan, and the key to the entire Japanese defensive system. Mount Tapochau rose 1,554 feet above sea level, its peaks shrouded in clouds that offered blessed relief from the crushing heat below. From its summit, Japanese observers could see every move we made, calling in artillery fire with deadly accuracy. The mountain was honeycombed with natural and artificial caves, some large enough to hide entire companies of troops. General Saito had made Tapochau the cornerstone of his defense. If we took it, his entire line would collapse. If we didn't, we'd be fighting for every yard of coral for months. The mission was clear. Take the mountain, whatever the cost. The assault began on June 22nd, a week after the initial landing. By then, we'd fought our way across most of southern Saipan, paying in blood for every village, every ridge, every patch of jungle. The 2nd Marine Division attacked from the south, while the 4th Marine Division came up from the east. My regiment, part of the 4th Division, drew eastern approaches, a maze of ravines and coral outcroppings that the Japanese had turned into a fortress. The first day was a disaster. Japanese artillery, hidden in caves near the summit, rained shells down on our advancing companies. Mortar teams, dug into reverse slope positions, dropped rounds with uncanny accuracy. Machine gun nests, invisible until you walked into their kill zones, cut down Marines by the dozen. My squad was part of the lead company, advancing up a narrow ravine that intelligence promised would take us to the mountain's base. The ravine turned out to be a killing ground. Japanese troops had positioned machine guns at both ends and on the heights above, creating a crossfire that trapped us in the open. The only cover was scattered boulders and the bodies of Marines who'd been caught in earlier attacks. "We can't stay here," Williams shouted over the chatter of enemy guns. His leg wound had reopened during the climb, leaving a trail of blood on the white coral. "They'll pick us off one by one." He was right, but the alternative wasn't much better. Going back meant crossing that same deadly ground under fire. Going forward meant charging uphill into prepared positions. Either way, men were going to die. "Danny," I called to Kowalski, "can you suppress that machine gun on the left?" The Iowa farm boy was already setting up his bar, bipod legs extended, ammunition belt feeding smoothly into the action. "Give me 30 seconds to get their heads down, then move." Those 30 seconds felt like 30 years. Danny poured 20 rounds into the Japanese position, his shots chipping coral and ricocheting off steel. The enemy fire slackened slightly, not much, but enough. "Go! Go! Go!" We went up that ravine like men possessed, screaming the Marine Corps war cry and firing from the hip. Rodriguez's replacement, a kid named Peterson from Minnesota, threw a grenade that landed right in the Japanese machine gun nest. The explosion silenced the gun and opened a gap in their line. But for every position we took, there seemed to be two more waiting. The Japanese had been preparing these defenses for months, and they'd learned from their defeats on other islands. No more banzai charges wasted in futile gestures. This time they fought smart, using the terrain and their knowledge of it to maximum advantage. It took us 4 days to fight our way to the base of Mount Tapochau summit. 4 days of hell that cost the 4th Marine Division over 400 casualties. My original squad of 12 men was down to 4: myself, Williams, Kowalski, and a replacement named Murphy who joined us after Hill 500. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing in action. But we weren't the only ones paying a price. Japanese losses were mounting too, and unlike us, they couldn't call for replacements. Every bunker we destroyed, every cave we cleared with flamethrowers, every sniper we picked off was one less defender. The mathematics of attrition were working in our favor, but the cost was measured in the lives of good Marines. On June 25th, we finally received orders to assault the summit itself. The attack would begin before dawn, with naval gunfire and airstrikes softening up the Japanese positions. 3 companies would hit the mountain from different directions, while the rest of the regiment remained in reserve. I remember lying in my foxhole that night, listening to the sounds of men preparing for battle. Some wrote letters they'd never send. Others cleaned weapons that were already spotless. A few tried to sleep, but most of us just lay there thinking about home, about the women we'd left behind, about the friends who wouldn't be coming back. "Sergeant," Murphy whispered. He was barely 19, a replacement who joined us straight from the States. "You think we'll make it?" It was a question every combat leader dreads, because there's no good answer. Tell him yes, and you might be lying. Tell him no, and you destroy what little morale he has left. Tell him you don't know, and you might as well admit that everything is chaos and chance. "Marines have been doing this since 1775, I said finally. "We've never lost a battle we couldn't win." It wasn't much of an answer, but it was the truth. Marines fight, Marines win, Marines come home. In that order. The attack began at 0500 hours with a rolling barrage from our artillery. Shells exploded across the mountainside in neat rows, advancing up the slope like a deadly carpet. Navy fighters swooped in to strafe Japanese positions, their machine guns sending streams of tracers into cave mouths and bunker apertures. When the barrage lifted, we went up that mountain like demons. My company took eastern face, climbing over coral formations that cut our hands and knees to ribbons. Japanese resistance was fierce but scattered. The bombardment had done its work, collapsing tunnels and burying gun positions under tons of coral and dirt. But some positions had survived, and the defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew they were going to die. A Japanese officer, sword in hand, led a countercharge that broke up one of our platoon's advance. Machine gun teams, firing from concealed positions, pinned down entire companies for hours. Snipers, hidden in the wreckage of trees destroyed by our bombardment, picked off Marines with deadly accuracy. The final assault on the summit came just after noon. Williams, his leg wound now wrapped in bloody bandages, led the charge up a coral slope littered with Japanese bodies. Kowalski provided covering fire, his bar chattering steadily as he swept enemy positions. Murphy, the young replacement, threw grenades with the accuracy of a major league pitcher. And then we were at the top, standing on the highest point on Saipan, looking down at the island we'd paid for in blood. The American flag went up at 13:47 hours on June 25, 1944. Below us, the Japanese defense began to crumble. While we were fighting for every yard of coral on Saipan, an even larger battle was raging in the waters around the Marianas. Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet had sortied from the Philippines with 9 aircraft carriers and 430 planes, determined to destroy our invasion force and retake the island. They ran straight into Admiral Spruance's Task Force 5815 carriers, 7 battleships, and over 900 aircraft. What followed was the largest carrier battle in history and the death knell of Japanese naval aviation. We could see some of it from the mountain of distant explosions on the horizon, smoke columns rising from burning ships, American fighters returning to their carriers with victory rolls that told their own story. But we didn't know the full scale of the victory until later. In 2 days of fighting, June 19 and 20, the Japanese lost over 400 aircraft and 3 aircraft carriers. The Americans lost 29 planes. Our pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and it effectively ended Japanese naval aviation as an offensive force. From then on, they'd be fighting a defensive war, trying to delay the inevitable. The victory at sea sealed Saipan's fate. With no hope of reinforcement or evacuation, General Saito's garrison was doomed. But the Japanese weren't ready to surrender. If anything, the knowledge that defeat was certain made them fight even harder. After Mount Tapochau fell, Japanese resistance on Saipan began to collapse, but it didn't end quietly. General Saito, knowing that his position was hopeless, decided to make one last gesture of defiance. On the night of July 6th, he ordered every able-bodied man in his command to participate in a final banzai charge against American lines. That's where this story began, with that scream in the darkness at 3 in the morning. 4,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and civilians, armed with everything from rifles to bamboo spears, charging into the teeth of American defensive positions. It was the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War and the most futile. But futile doesn't mean harmless. Those 4,000 men, knowing they were going to die, were determined to take as many Americans with them as possible. They hit our lines like a tidal wave, overwhelming some positions through sheer numbers and fanatical courage. My squad was holding a section of line near the village of Makuncha when they came. The ground shook under their feet as they ran toward our positions, screaming at the top of their lungs, bayonets gleaming in the darkness. Artillery flares burst overhead, casting everything in hellish red light. "Here they come," Williams shouted, though we could all see them by then. Hundreds of running figures silhouetted against the flares, getting closer every second. We opened fire at 200 yards. Every Marine on the line was shooting as fast as he could work his bolt. Machine guns chattered continuously, their muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness. Artillery shells landed among the charging Japanese, each explosion creating gaps in their ranks that filled immediately as more men rushed forward. But they kept coming. They climbed over their own dead, stepped through curtains of machine gun fire that would have stopped any rational attack, and died with their emperor's name on their lips. Some made it all the way to our foxholes, where the fighting became hand-to-hand, bayonet against bayonet, Marine against Japanese soldier in a struggle that would have been familiar to warriors from any century. Kowalski's bar jammed just as a Japanese soldier leaped into our position, bayonet aimed at the big Iowa boy's chest. I put 3 rounds from my Thompson into the attacker's midsection, spinning him around and dropping him in the coral dust. Danny cleared his weapon and kept firing, sweat pouring down his face despite the pre-dawn chill. The charge lasted 3 hours. When dawn broke on July 7, 1944, over 3,000 Japanese lay dead in front of our lines. American casualties were heavy too, nearly 1,000 killed and wounded, but the line had held. With that charge, organized Japanese resistance on Saipan effectively ended. General Saito committed suicide that morning, following the samurai tradition rather than face the shame of defeat. Admiral Nagumo, the same man who had commanded the carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor, joined him in death. The few thousand Japanese soldiers still alive on the island either surrendered or went into hiding in the caves and jungle, where they'd be hunted down over the following weeks. Saipan was declared secure on July 9, 1944, 25 days after the initial landing. The cost had been enormous, over 400 Americans killed and 13,000 wounded. Japanese losses were even higher, 24,000 soldiers and sailors dead, plus an estimated 22,000 civilians who died in the fighting or committed suicide rather than surrender. But the strategic victory was immense. With Saipan in American hands, B-29 bombers could reach the Japanese home islands. The supply lines that kept Japan's war machine running were cut. Most importantly, the myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered once and for all. I flew out of Saipan on a hospital transport 3 days after the island was declared secure. Williams was on the same plane, his leg wound finally serious enough to require evacuation to a hospital in Hawaii. Kowalski had taken a piece of shrapnel in his shoulder during the final banzai charge, but he'd recovered enough to stay with the regiment. Murphy, the young replacement who'd asked if we'd make it, hadn't made it himself. A Japanese mortar round had found his foxhole during the second day of fighting for the mountain. As our transport circled the island before heading east, I looked down at the coral and jungle that had cost so many lives. Smoke was still rising from destroyed Japanese positions. American bulldozers were already at work, clearing airfields and building bases for the next phase of the war. In a few months, this peaceful-looking island would be launching bombing raids against Tokyo itself. The stewardess, a Navy nurse with tired eyes, stopped by my stretcher. "How are you feeling, Sergeant?" I thought about that question. How was I feeling? Grateful to be alive, proud of what we'd accomplished, sick at heart over the friends who wouldn't be going home, determined to see this war through to the end, no matter what it cost. "I'm feeling like a Marine," I said finally. She smiled and moved on to the next wounded man. Outside the windows, Saipan grew smaller and smaller until it was just another speck in the vast Pacific. But what had happened there would echo through history. Looking back now, 70 years later, I can see why Saipan was the turning point of the Pacific War. It wasn't just another island in a chain of islands. It was the key that unlocked Japan's inner defenses, the beginning of the end for the Japanese Empire. Within months of Saipan's capture, B-29s were bombing Japanese cities with increasing intensity. The supply lines from Southeast Asia were cut, starving Japan of the raw materials needed to continue the war. Most importantly, the Japanese government finally began to understand that they couldn't win, that American industrial might and military determination would eventually overwhelm them no matter how bravely their soldiers fought. Prime Minister Tojo's government fell as a direct result of Saipan's loss. Emperor Hirohito himself began to consider the possibility of surrender, though it would take another year and the atomic bombs to finally convince him. The myth of the invincible Japanese Empire, carefully cultivated since the Meiji Restoration, died in the coral caves and ravines of a small island in the Central Pacific. But the cost was real, and it was paid in the lives of young men from places like Iowa and Alabama and Minnesota and Texas. Marines who volunteered to fight for their country and died far from home, buried in cemeteries carved from coral and watered with tears. They deserved better than to die on a foreign island whose name most Americans couldn't pronounce. Yet they also deserved to be remembered for what they accomplished. They broke the back of Japanese resistance in the Pacific. They opened the door to victory. They proved that American Marines, properly led and adequately supplied, could take any position the enemy could hold. I think about them sometimes: Williams with his Alabama drawing his wounded leg, Kowalski from the Iowa cornfields who could make his bar sing like an angel of death, young Rodriguez who died calling for his mother, Murphy who asked if we'd make it and didn't make it himself. They were ordinary men who did extraordinary things, and they changed the course of history. Saipan taught us that victory was possible, but it also taught us what victory would cost. The Japanese weren't going to surrender easily. Every island, every city, every mile of Japanese soil would have to be paid for in blood and sacrifice. The road to Tokyo led through hell, and we were the ones who would have to walk it. But we would walk it. That's what Marines do. We fight, we win, we come home. In that order, always in that order. And on a small island in the Central Pacific, in the summer of 1944, we proved that no enemy position was strong enough to stop us. The coral beaches of Saipan are quiet now, washed by the same Pacific waves that carried us ashore in June 1944. The caves where Japanese soldiers made their last stand are silent. The airfields from which B-29s once launched to bomb Japan are overgrown with jungle vegetation. But if you know where to look, you can still find traces of what happened there. Rusted pieces of equipment half buried in the sand. Concrete bunkers slowly being reclaimed by jungle. And in the military cemetery overlooking the sea, white crosses and stars of David marking the graves of Marines who gave everything for victory. They rest there still, those young men who stormed ashore on that distant morning in 1944. They rest there, and they wait for the rest of us to remember what they did, and why it mattered, and what it cost to break the back of tyranny in the Pacific. I was there. I saw what they did. I lived to tell their story. This is their story. This is Saipan.